In the early 1960s, in a small office somewhere in the corridor of decisions that determined which comedians made it to national television and which ones didn't, someone picked up the phone and asked if George Carlin was available for The Tonight Show. It was not a moment that looked historic from the outside. Carson's Tonight Show had been calling comedians since 1962, when Carson took over the desk from Jack Paar and immediately began remaking the program in his own image. By the mid-1960s, an appearance on The Tonight Show was the single most significant thing that could happen to a comedian's career. Not because of the money, though the money was real, but because of the audience. 30 million people, every night. A comedian who landed on that stage and made Carson laugh could go from working regional clubs on a Thursday to having his phone ring off the desk by the following Monday. Carlin was 27 years old when those calls started. He had been working steadily, radio work in Boston and Fort Worth, the act he had built with Jack Burns, the careful observational material he had developed for the television market. He was moving in the right direction. But the right direction in comedy can feel for a very long time like no direction at all. There were hundreds of comedians moving in the right direction. Only a few of them ever arrived anywhere that mattered. Then the phone rang, and the name at the other end of the call was The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. Carlin prepared for the appearance the way he prepared for every performance, by understanding exactly what he was doing and why, which had not always been a simple calculation for him. His act in the early 1960s was polished and audience-tested. He knew what worked. He knew the timing on the impressions, the rhythm of the wordplay, the shapes of the bits that got the response he was looking for. But he also knew, with the particular self-awareness that would eventually push him toward the more honest work he would make in the following decade, that what he was doing was calibrated for a specific kind of approval. It was designed to be liked. That was not a criticism. Being liked was the currency of the business he was in. But there was a part of him that understood the difference between material that was liked and material that was true, and he had not yet resolved what to do about that difference. The Tonight Show appearance was not the place to resolve it. Whatever private questions Carlin carried about the nature of his own comedy, the Carson appearance was a test of the comedian he was at that moment. And the comedian he was at that moment was a very good one. Clean material, strong instincts, sharp timing. He walked out from behind the curtain into the studio lights. The studio held a particular energy on taping nights, not quite the energy of a live performance, but not the deadened atmosphere of a purely technical production either. The audience was real. Their reactions were real. And Carson, seated behind the desk, watched each new performer the way he watched all of them, with a quiet, evaluative attention that experienced comedians described as almost like being read. Carlin stood at the microphone. The audience settled, and he began. To understand what that call meant, it helps to understand what The Tonight Show was in the early and mid-1960s, and what Johnny Carson had made of it in the years since he took the desk. Carson had arrived at The Tonight Show in 1962 with a particular quality that was almost impossible to manufacture. He was genuinely curious. Not performatively curious, not curious in the way a talk show host is curious because curiosity is part of the format, but actually interested in the people sitting across from him, in what they had built, in the particular texture of what made each of them distinctive. He was also, quietly, a student of comedy. He had come up through stand-up and had a performer's eye for what made a comedian work, not just technically, but in the deeper sense of whether the person had something real behind the material. The comedians he invited onto the show were not chosen at random. Carson and his team were building something, a particular version of what late-night television could be, one in which comedy was treated as a serious craft rather than as filler between commercials. The acts Carson favored were the ones that surprised him, that had specificity, that couldn't be easily categorized and dismissed. He had made careers by genuinely laughing at the right moment. A laugh from Carson at the right instant could change the trajectory of a performer's life in ways that no amount of club bookings could replicate. For a young comedian in the early 1960s, waiting to see whether that invitation would come was not a passive experience. It was the organizing anxiety of an entire career phase. You worked. You refined the material. You took the regional gigs and the club dates and the occasional local television appearance. And somewhere underneath all of it, you waited to find out whether the person on the other end of the most important phone in American television had noticed you. Carlin had been noticed. The specifics of how Carson came to be aware of him varied depending on the account, whether it was a particular performance, a recording, a recommendation from someone already in Carson's orbit. What mattered was the outcome. An invitation to The Tonight Show, extended at a moment when Carlin was still building the foundation of a national career rather than standing on one. What happened in the minutes that followed is the kind of thing that looks, in retrospect, like it was always going to happen. But that feeling is a trick of hindsight. In the moment, it was anything but certain. Carlin performed well. That much is established. He moved through his material with the control and precision of a comedian who knew exactly what he was doing, and the audience responded in the way that good material by a polished comedian earns a response. But the moment that mattered, the one that changed the shape of what followed, was not the laugh at the end of a bit. It was the moment Carson laughed. A Carson laugh was not simply a polite response. People who worked on The Tonight Show in those years describe it consistently. When Carson genuinely laughed at something, the quality of his reaction was entirely different from his professional courtesy laugh. It was real. It broke through the control that made him so effective as a host. It was the laugh of a man who had been surprised by something and who was not pretending. When that laugh came, when Carson leaned back behind the desk and the laugh that followed was real, the studio audience felt it immediately. There was a shift, a collective reading of the room. Someone new had arrived, and the man at the desk had confirmed it. After the taping, Carlin was invited to the desk. He sat across from Carson and they talked about comedy, about where he had come from, about the work. Carson was a man who did not waste time on conversations he found uninteresting, and he did not rush this one. He asked questions and listened to the answers. He treated the young comedian across from him as someone worth taking seriously. Carlin would return to The Tonight Show many times over the course of his career. The relationship between the two men developed over years into one of mutual professional respect. Not a close personal friendship, but the deeper and rarer thing of two skilled people who had recognized in each other a genuine commitment to the craft. Carson continued to invite Carlin back when others in the industry were uncertain about where Carlin's increasingly radical material was going. He trusted what he had seen that first night, and that trust was not revoked when Carlin began to change. For Carlin, the first Tonight Show appearance was the moment his career crossed a line it could not uncross. Before it, he was a comedian building towards something. After it, he was a comedian with a national audience that had seen him stand in the right room and be confirmed by the right person. The door that opened that night did not close again. What Carson had seen, in the few minutes Carlin stood at that microphone, was something that could not be manufactured. The specific quality of a comedian who was exactly himself. Not a version of someone else, not a safe approximation of what a comedian was supposed to be, but the particular, unrepeatable thing that Carlin was when he was working well. That was what the call had been about. That was what the invitation had been for. Carson had wanted to see whether the comedian he had heard about was the same comedian who appeared when the lights came on and the cameras rolled and the audience was watching. He had wanted to know if Carlin was real. He was. And Carson had laughed in the particular way he laughed when something was real, and the room had understood. The phone call had been ordinary. What it started was not.